questions I get asked fairly often is what's the advantage in actually paying attention to indexes? So I just want to explain, I guess, a little bit about the way that I go about it, and ultimately that's sort of where I see a lot of success in my breeding program, and that's where M13, being the highest ranked bull in Australia across indexes, really does sort of raise the attention. But also what the indexes are all about is about how many dollars the commercial outcomes are going to be worth, and then comparing different animals for that. Certainly commercial animals and sort of show animals are very different. The show animals are pampered, but the commercial outcomes are not really that important. It's more about the way the animal looks, their temperament and so forth. Whereas what we're trying to do in the stud game here at Clunes Crossing is breed perfect structure, but also to add good commercial outcomes. And one way that we measure that is through the indexes. As an example, the Angus Index, which is sort of the first one that's generally ranked, all of the index have regard to whether that animal has got maternal traits. So, are we going to actually retain the females? So all of the indexes that I'm going to go through assumes that you're going to keep the female progeny. What's important about that is that we can't therefore ignore birth weights and return to calve and all of those maternal trait EBVs. So they're solid. I like that because it is all about putting calves on the ground. So there's no point having females that are worth a lot but they can't breed, or they have problems when they do have calves. But the Angus Index is one that I like to reference, even AI size that I'm looking to buy in, and certainly the bulls that that we're producing. I try to even that up because what the Angus Index does is focus very heavily on, it focuses on the commercial outcome, but it looks at whether the animal is good for the majority of markets. Let's start with the domestic index. So the domestic index is again about a self-replacing herd. Daughters are retained for breeding. The steer progeny finished on either pasture and grain, or grain, and then are suitable and sold into the domestic supermarket market. The steer progeny generally on average, this index is looking at steer progeny slaughtered at a carcass weight of 270 kilograms at 16 months. So if you're selling that, so that's the domestic market. So if you're selling your calves or your progeny into the domestic market, then that's probably an index that you want to pay a lot of attention to. It's going to look at whether the females are solid, but also whether your animals are going to be finishing suitable for the domestic market. So that becomes important when you're choosing a bull and when you're assessing your cows as to whether you're retaining cows or not when you go through your herd. So the domestic index, there is something to watch if that's your market. The heavy grain fed index, as an example of where the differences are, it's again looking at self-replacement herd. Daughters are retained for breeding. Steer progeny pasture grown with a 200-day feedlot finishing period. So it's looking very specifically at that market. And then the steers being slaughtered at 420 kilogram carcass weight at 24 months. So, and then finished on grain. So it's going to look at something different. And generally what you're trying to achieve if you're selling into that heavy, or you're putting your progeny into feedlots, and for the feedlots themselves, is targeting high marbling, premium quality carcass traits. So there's going to be weighting towards marbling and heavier, larger eye muscle area, etc. So that's the heavy grain fed index. And then the heavy grass fed, again, it's all about a self-replacement herd. Daughters retained for breeding. Steer progeny finished on grass, obviously. And then the steer progeny slaughtered at a carcass weight of 340 kilos at 22 months of age, and eating quality traits important to the MSA. So it's very realistic. If you're finishing your steers on grass and then selling them, at the 650 live weight, 340 kilogram carcass weight at 22 months, then that's the index you really want to have a look at. Being that many of our clients have got many different markets that they're aiming for, I focus a lot on the Angus breed index. M3 as an example, he sort of topped the grass and the grain. But across the board, when if you were to do a search and you put his indexes into a search and then look for animals with those traits or better, then he lands as number one. So he's sort of the best all-round option. And it's the same with his brothers. They come from the same breeding in the cows, as in the cows were by Berkeley and then sired by Profit. And that for us has worked extremely well insofar as the structure is very good and the indexes are all lining up. But I'll put a series of short videos up just explaining different EBVs also. So I've just spoken about indexes. I also want to speak about EBVs and why you would focus on them. I know there's some skepticism in and around that. But hey, we as stud producers, we can only put the data in, the scan data, the live data. We do genomics on the animals, so it's looking at a lot deeper than just the figures and looking at all of their breeding and their DNA. I'm really enjoying where Angus is taking it. It certainly helps me a lot when I'm choosing animals, and it helps my clients a lot working out which bull I recommend to them for their right market. So I'll be back with a series of different videos also.